My parents charged me $5 for smiling and $10 for laughing since I was 4 years old. By the time I was 17, they said I owed them $300,000 in joy debt until they made the mistake of showing their detailed ledgers to my school principal. From the moment I was born, my parents drilled it into me that to keep me from becoming soft, I needed to pay them every time I demonstrated for unearned happiness. The day I turned 4, they started keeping a running tab of every time I looked happy, and this was money I'd need to pay back when I turned 18. My parents met working at a debt collection agency where they bonded over making people cry. They'd compete to see who could extract the most money from the most desperate cases, then go out to celebrate their victories. When I was little, they'd fine me for everything. $1 for spilling milk, 5 for talking back, 10 for crying. They kept a ledger on the kitchen wall tracking every penny I owed them for being a burden. Dad would calculate the cost of my existence down to the penny, while Mom itemized my disappointments. I thought all parents kept running tabs on their children. On my 10th birthday, instead of giving me presents, my parents presented me with a laminated price chart. Smiling, $5. Laughing, $10. Visible joy, $25 per incident. They explained that happiness was a luxury I couldn't afford, and every moment of pleasure would be added to my growing debt. They'd already installed cameras to catch any unauthorized joy, and they showed me the Excel spreadsheet where they'd track every instance. By 18, you'll either be miserable or bankrupt, Mom said. We're teaching you that happy people are parasites who drain everyone around them, just like you're draining us. The first laugh after that cost me $10 I didn't have. They added interest. After that, I became some kind of emotional accountant. I'd budget my reactions. Could I afford to smile at my friend's joke? Was laughing at a movie worth the $50 it would add to my debt? I learned to cull joy before it reached my face, perfecting a dead expression that revealed nothing. The cameras made it worse. They caught everything. A slight upturn of my lips while reading. A chuckle I tried to swallow. Even the relaxed face I made while sleeping that they classified as contentment. Every morning, my parents would review the footage and present me with an itemized bill. Tuesday, 3:15 p.m., smiled at dog, $5. Thursday, 11:22 a.m., laughed at classmate, $10. By 13, I owed them $12,000. They charged compound interest and late fees when I couldn't make monthly payments from my babysitting money. They'd garnish my birthday money, my allowance, every penny I earned. When I had nothing left to take, they started selling my possessions to pay down the joy debt. Friends stopped hanging out with me because I was a black hole where fun went to die. I couldn't laugh at jokes, couldn't smile at compliments, couldn't even look pleased when I aced a test. Teachers thought I was depressed, but I was just poor. Every moment of happiness I couldn't afford pushed me deeper into emotional bankruptcy. I watched other kids laugh freely and felt like I was watching rich people burn money. By 15, I owed $40,000 and had nothing left to lose, so I decided to rack up as much joy debt as possible. I figured if I was going to be bankrupt either way, I might as well be happy. I started laughing at everything. Stupid commercials, my own jokes, the absurdity of my situation. I smiled until my face hurt, grinned through dinner, beamed during their lectures about fiscal responsibility. That's another $25, Mom would say, and I'd laugh harder. Make it 50, you ungrateful little bitch. I joined the drama club and got cast in a comedy where I got to laugh for 2 hours straight every night. The bill from that show alone was $8,000. I sang in the shower, unauthorized musical joy, $30, danced in my room, physical expression of happiness, $40, and smiled at myself in the mirror just to watch the numbers climb. I felt free for the first time, because what more could they do to me? Well, when my debt hit 6 figures, my parents escalated from financial to physical enforcement. They started collecting in other ways. 1 minute of standing in stress positions for every dollar I couldn't pay. 5 push-ups per smile. 10 laps around the yard for each laugh. When I kept smiling through the punishments, they moved to public humiliation, making me wear a sign listing my debt and stand outside our church. Then they started going after other people. They sent invoices to my friends' parents for enabling joy transactions, threatened to sue my drama teacher for contributing to a minor's debt, and got me fired from my job by telling my boss I was a financial liability with poor impulse control. They isolated me completely, cutting off every source of both money and happiness. You think this is funny? Dad screamed as my debt passed $150,000. We'll garnish your wages for the rest of your life. You'll die in debt like a worthless leech you are. No one will ever love something as expensive as you. Then he slapped me across the face. But then the worst possible thing happened. I tried to get a bank account when I was 17, and that's how I discovered my parents had already destroyed my credit by opening cards in my name and maxing them out. I guess they didn't want to wait before they started making money off me. The bank manager saw a teenager with 6 figures of debt and called the authorities. And when my parents heard about that, they went absolutely crazy. They dragged me out of bed at 3 in the morning. Dad grabbed my hair while Mom swept everything off my desk onto the floor. My laptop crashed against the wall. My phone shattered under Dad's heel. Every piece of paper, every notebook I'd kept hidden, they tore apart searching for evidence of what I'd done. Mom found my emergency cash stash taped under my drawer. $200 I'd saved from selling plasma behind their backs. She ripped each bill in half while maintaining eye contact. Dad discovered my college applications hidden in my mattress and fed them to the shredder one by one. The acceptance letter from State University with a partial scholarship went last. They made me stand in the corner while they destroyed my room. Every possession that brought me even a hint of comfort got demolished. My books went into garbage bags. My art supplies snapped in half. The stuffed bear I'd hidden since childhood got its head ripped off. They worked methodically, cataloging each item's destruction in their ledger as collection activities. When morning came, they locked me in my empty room. No furniture except a mattress on the floor. No clothes except what I wore. They removed the door handle from the inside and nailed boards over my window. I could hear them calling my school, my job, my friends' parents. Each conversation the same story about their troubled daughter who'd committed fraud and needed to be kept away from decent people. They brought me 1 meal a day, sliding it through a slot they'd cut in the door. Always the same, plain rice and water. While I ate, they'd stand outside reciting my new debt total. With the credit cards they'd opened, plus my joy debt, plus new charges for room and board during my detention, I owed them over $300,000. On the 3rd day, I heard them on the phone with someone. Dad's voice carried through the thin walls. He was explaining how their minor child had stolen their identity and run up massive debts. How they were generous enough not to press charges if I agreed to sign over my future earnings. How they had documentation proving I'd been stealing from them since age 4. They let me out after a week, but only to parade me through the house and show me what they'd done. Every photo of me had been removed from the walls. My name was crossed out in the family Bible. They'd turned my childhood room into Mom's new office, complete with a desk made from my dismantled bed frame. The new rules were simple. I could leave my room for school and work only. No speaking to anyone beyond necessary interactions. No facial expressions that could be interpreted as emotional. They installed a tracking app on a flip phone that could only call them. Any deviation from approved routes would add $1,000 to my debt. At school, I discovered they'd been thorough. My guidance counselor pulled me aside to discuss my situation. My parents had sent the school a detailed letter letter about my supposed theft and manipulation. My teachers looked at me differently. My drama club director informed me I was no longer welcome, citing concerns about the legal threats my parents had made. My friends avoided me in the hallways. Their parents had received invoices and legal notices. One girl's mom had been billed $500 for harboring a joy fugitive when I'd smiled at her daughter's birthday party. Another family got sued for contributing to minor delinquency after inviting me to their barbecue. The message was clear. Associating with me came with a price. I ate lunch alone in the bathroom stall. During free periods, I sat in the library with my dead expression, doing homework for classes I'd soon be pulled from. My parents had already informed me that college was impossible for someone with my debt load. After graduation, I'd work multiple jobs to pay them back, living in their house under their rules until every penny was collected. But I noticed something they'd missed in their destruction. The library had computers, old ones that barely worked, but they had internet. During study hall, I researched. I learned about financial abuse. I discovered that parents couldn't legally charge their minor children for existing. I found out that opening credit cards in your child's name was identity theft, not parenting. I started documenting everything on the library computers. I created email accounts they didn't know about. I took photos of their ledgers when they weren't looking, uploading them to cloud storage. I'm really curious about this whole debt system the parents created. How did they even come up with specific prices like $5 for smiling and $25 for visible joy? I recorded their threats on the school's old tape recorder, hiding it in my backpack during their lectures. Every piece of evidence got backed up in places they'd never think to look. The librarian noticed what I was doing. Mrs. Chen had worked at the school for 30 years and had seen enough troubled kids to recognize one. She started staying late, keeping the library open an extra hour so I could finish my research. She never asked questions, just occasionally left printouts about emancipation law on my desk. My parents escalated when they realized I wasn't breaking. The physical punishments got worse. They made me kneel on rice while reciting my debt. They took away my mattress so I slept on the floor. They stopped letting me shower more than once a week. When I still didn't cry or beg, they got creative. They started inviting people over to witness my corrections. Church members, neighbors, their co-workers. They'd make me stand in the living room while they explained my crimes, showing off their detailed spreadsheets of my emotional theft. Some visitors looked uncomfortable. Others nodded along, praising them for their firm hand with such a difficult child. One visitor changed everything. Mr. Rodriguez from their old debt collection agency came for dinner. While my parents showed off their records, I saw his expression shift. He recognized their methods, their language, their obsessive documentation. These weren't concerned parents. These were collectors who'd found the perfect mark, their own child. He asked to use the bathroom and slipped me his business card on the way. On the back, he'd written, "Document everything. Build your case. The law is on your side." He left early, claiming a work emergency. My parents were too busy calculating that day's joy charges to notice his discomfort. I became more careful, but more determined. Every bruise got photographed at school when teachers weren't looking. Every threatening voicemail got saved. Every instance of them destroying my property or denying me food got logged. I built my case like they'd built my debt, methodically, obsessively, completely. They made their biggest mistake when they tried to pull me out of school. The paperwork required a meeting with administrators. They sat across from the principal, explaining how I needed to work full-time to pay my debts. They brought their ledgers, their contracts, their evidence of my crimes. They were so proud of their system they couldn't see how insane they looked. The principal's face went from confused to concerned to horrified as they explained their joy charging system. When they showed him the bills they'd sent to other families, he excused himself to make a phone call. My parents were too deep in their own righteousness to realize they'd just confessed to years of abuse to a mandated reporter. I sat in that office, maintaining my dead expression while my insides screamed with hope. My parents kept talking, kept showing evidence, kept digging their own grave with every word. They'd trained me too well. I gave nothing away, even as I watched my prison walls start to crack. The meeting ended with the principal thanking them for coming. My parents left satisfied, certain they'd won. They didn't notice the school resource officer watching them leave. They didn't see the principal immediately call an emergency staff meeting. They were too busy calculating how much money I'd make working full-time at minimum wage. That night, they celebrated their victory. They ordered pizza for themselves while I ate my rice. They loudly discussed which jobs I'd work, how they'd garnish my wages, how many decades it would take to pay them back. They'd already drafted a contract for me to sign on my 18th birthday, giving them control of my finances until my debt was cleared. I lay on my floor that night, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring the storm. The authorities would come. My parents would rage. The careful system they'd built would collapse. But tonight, I allowed myself one thing I hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was free, and they'd never know I had it. The morning arrived with footsteps on the stairs. Heavy ones that meant Dad was coming, not the lighter tread of Mom. I rolled off the floor and stood against the wall, maintaining the blank expression they demanded. The door opened and Dad entered with a clipboard, reviewing yesterday's charges. He circled the room, examining every corner for signs of contraband happiness. Finding nothing, he grunted and motioned for me to follow. Downstairs, Mom waited at the kitchen table with stacks of paperwork. New contracts covered every surface. Employment agreements, wage garnishment forms, power of attorney documents. They'd spent the night preparing for my future servitude. I signed where they pointed, my hand steady despite the rage building inside. Each signature felt like another bar on my cage, but I gave them nothing. No tremor, no hesitation, no emotion they could monetize. They watched me like predators, waiting for any crack in my facade. School that day brought new humiliations. My locker had been cleared out by the administration, my belongings boxed up and waiting in the office. The secretary handed them over with pitying eyes while explaining that my parents had requested all my academic records. They were withdrawing me at the end of the week. Mrs. Chen intercepted me in the hallway between classes. She pressed a folder into my hands and walked away without speaking. Inside, I found printouts about legal aid services, emancipation procedures, and a handwritten note with a phone number. The risk she took could have cost her job if my parents found out. During lunch, I used the library computer to email the photos I'd taken of their ledgers to the email account I'd created. The images showed years of meticulous documentation of their abuse, all in their own handwriting. Every joy charge, every punishment, every twisted rule they'd imposed. Their obsession with record-keeping would be their downfall. The resource officer appeared at the library door, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. My heart hammered as he approached, but his expression remained neutral. He asked me to come with him, and I followed on wooden legs, certain my parents had discovered my activities. Instead, he led me to a small conference room where a woman in a suit waited. She introduced herself as a social worker from Child Protective Services. Someone had reported concerns about my home situation. She asked gentle questions about my life, my parents, the bruises on my arms that I thought my sleeves had hidden. I answered carefully, testing each word before speaking. The truth wanted to pour out, but years of conditioning held me back. She noticed my hesitation and changed tactics, asking about school instead. Safer ground. I told her about my grades, my plans for college that my parents had destroyed. She took notes while I spoke, her face carefully neutral. When she asked about the withdrawal paperwork. I explained that my parents felt I needed to work instead of finishing school. Her pen paused. She asked my age, and when I confirmed I was 17, she made another note. The meeting ended with her giving me a business card and explaining that she'd be in touch. She emphasized that I could call her anytime, day or night, if I needed help. The resource officer walked me back to class, and I spent the rest of the day wondering if I'd said too much or not enough. At home, my parents waited with new fury. The school had called about the social worker's visit. Dad's face was purple with rage while Mom paced the kitchen, muttering about ungrateful children and government overreach. They demanded to know what I'd told her. I maintained my blank expression and recited facts. She asked about school. I told her about my grades. She asked about college. I explained you'd withdrawn my applications. Nothing more, nothing less. They searched my face for deception, but found only the empty mask they'd trained me to wear. The punishment that night involved standing in the corner until midnight, reciting my debt total every 5 minutes. My legs cramped and my throat went raw, but I never wavered. I'd learned to retreat inside myself during these sessions, planning my next moves while my body endured. They escalated over the following days. Mom started following me at school, sitting in her car where she could watch the exits. Dad installed new locks on my bedroom door, the kind that locked from the outside. They disconnected the house phone and hid their cell phones, cutting off any communication with the outside world. But they'd made a crucial error. In their focus on controlling me, they'd forgotten about their own paper trail. The documents they'd proudly shown the principal, the invoices they'd sent to other families, the detailed records they'd kept for 13 years. All of it evidence of systematic abuse, documented in their own hands. The social worker called the house 3 days later. I heard Mom's voice rise as she argued, insisting they were good parents dealing with a troubled child. The conversation ended with Mom slamming the phone down and announcing that CPS wanted a home visit. They had 48 hours to prepare. The transformation was immediate. They unlocked my door and returned my mattress. Mom cooked actual meals while Dad removed the boards from my window. They coached me on what to say, how to act, what would happen if I didn't cooperate. The threats were specific and detailed. I nodded along, memorizing their instructions while planning my own strategy. They wanted me to perform the role of a rebellious teenager who'd stolen their credit cards. I'd give them a performance, just not the one they expected. Every word would be carefully chosen to reveal the truth while seeming to follow their script. The night before the visit, they made their biggest mistake yet. What's making them suddenly change everything in the house? Unlocking doors, returning the mattress, cooking real meals. The timing feels oddly specific with that 48-hour warning, like they know exactly what CPS looks for during home visits, which makes me wonder if they've dealt with this before somehow. Confident in their control, they left me alone while they went to consult with a lawyer friend about their rights. The house was mine for 2 precious hours. I photographed everything. The ledgers, the contracts, the spreadsheets, the laminated price chart still hanging in the kitchen. I found more than I'd expected in Dad's office. Bank statements showing the credit cards in my name, opened when I was 12. Printed emails between my parents discussing their investment strategy of building debt in my name. A folder labeled collection plans with detailed calculations of how much they could extract from my future wages. Everything got uploaded to my cloud storage, backed up to multiple accounts. I even found their passwords, written on a sticky note under the keyboard like the amateurs they were. Their email accounts revealed correspondence with creditors, all pretending I was the one who'd charged thousands in electronics and cash advances. I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it and retreated to my room before they returned. They checked on me immediately, suspicious of the quiet house, but found me lying on my mattress staring at the ceiling, the same broken child they'd left behind. The social worker arrived the next morning with a colleague. My parents greeted them with practiced smiles and offers of coffee. They'd rehearsed their story all night, prepared for any question. What they hadn't prepared for was me following their script too perfectly. When asked about the credit cards, I recited their exact words about being a troubled child who'd stolen from them, but I delivered the lines with the same dead expression I used for everything, turning their lie into obvious coaching. The social workers exchanged glances as I continued the monotone performance. My parents jumped in, elaborating on my supposed crimes with increasing desperation. The more they talked, the more unhinged they sounded. Mom pulled out her documentation to prove their point, not realizing she was handing over evidence of abuse. The ledgers, the joy charges, the punishment schedules, all presented like reasonable parenting tools. The social workers took photos of everything. They asked to see my room, and my parents couldn't refuse without looking suspicious. The bare space with its external locks told its own story. They asked about my belongings, and Dad explained they'd been sold to pay my debts, still not grasping how insane that sounded. The visit stretched for hours. They interviewed me separately, away from my parents' watchful eyes. I stuck to the script, but let my exhaustion show. Yes, I'd taken the credit cards when I was 12 to buy thousands in electronics I'd never seen. The absurdity of the story became more apparent with each detail. When they finally left, my parents were confident they'd won. They'd shown their documentation, proven their case, demonstrated their firm parenting. They celebrated with wine while I returned to my empty room, knowing the real storm was still building. The next few days passed in tense quiet. My parents waited for CPS to close the case, certain their performance had worked. They eased some restrictions, letting me shower daily and providing actual meals. They needed me healthy looking for any follow-up visits. School became my refuge, the few hours where I could plan without surveillance. Mrs. Chen continued slipping me information about legal resources. The resource officer checked on me daily, just a casual greeting that let me know he was watching. Even some teachers seemed more attentive, finding excuses to keep me after class and ask how I was doing. Rodriguez called the house one evening, ostensibly to catch up with my parents. They put him on speaker, eager to brag about their success with CPS. He congratulated them on their thorough documentation, then casually mentioned that identity theft was a federal crime with serious penalties. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents tried to laugh it off, but Rodriguez continued. He'd seen cases like this in his career. Parents who'd gotten carried away with their systems usually ended badly once authorities looked closely at the financial records. He wished them luck and hung up, leaving my parents staring at each other across the kitchen table. The paranoia set in immediately. They pulled out their documents, reviewing them with new eyes. The credit card statements with my name, the emails discussing their plans, the years of joy charges that suddenly looked less like parenting and more like extortion. They'd been so proud of their system they'd never considered how it would look to outsiders. They burned documents in the backyard that night, feeding years of evidence into the flames, but they couldn't burn everything. The credit cards still existed. The debt was real. The emails lived on servers they couldn't access. Their paper trail was too extensive to fully erase. I watched from my window as they destroyed their own evidence, knowing I had copies of everything important. They were panicking now, making mistakes. Mom forgot to lock my door one night. Dad left his phone unattended while showering. Small errors that gave me opportunities. The school called about my withdrawal, wanting to schedule a final meeting. My parents had no choice but to attend or risk looking negligent. They coached me again on the drive there, threats mixed with promises. If I cooperated, they'd reduce my debt. If I didn't, they had friends who could make my life even worse. But when we arrived, the meeting wasn't what they'd expected. The principal principal, my guidance counselor, 2 social workers, and a woman who introduced herself as a guardian ad litem appointed by the court. My parents' faces went white as they realized this wasn't about withdrawal paperwork. The guardian explained that based on the CPS investigation, the court had concerns about my welfare. She would be representing my interests while the investigation continued. My parents tried to object, but she cut them off with practiced efficiency. This wasn't a debate, it was notification. The meeting revealed how thoroughly my parents had exposed themselves. Every document they'd proudly shared, every invoice they'd sent to other families, every threat they'd made to teachers and employers. It had all been collected, compiled, and submitted to the court. Their own obsessive record-keeping had created a perfect case against them. They tried to maintain control on the drive home, but I could see the cracks forming. Mom's hands shook on the steering wheel. Dad muttered about lawyers and rights. They'd spent so many years as the collectors, they'd never imagined becoming the collected. The system they'd weaponized against me was turning on them. That night, they made me sign new documents. Confessions that I'd lied to CPS, that I'd stolen the credit cards, that I'd manipulated everyone. They filmed me reading the statements, thinking video evidence would save them. I complied with the same dead expression, knowing coerced confessions would only dig their hole deeper. The guardian visited the next day, interviewing me without my parents present. She'd seen the joy charge documents, the punishment schedules, the credit card fraud. She asked careful questions designed to build a legal case. I answered honestly for the first time in years, the words flowing easier with each truth told. She explained my options. Emergency removal was possible but complicated. Foster care at 17 came with its own challenges, but there were other paths. Emancipation, staying with relatives, legal remedies for the financial abuse. She promised to explore every option while keeping me as safe as possible. My parents sensed the shift in power. Their threats became pleas. They offered to forgive the joy debt if I'd just tell everyone it was a misunderstanding. They'd let me finish school, even help with college. All I had to do was make this go away. The desperation in their voices was something I'd never heard before, but I'd learned their own lessons too well. Every interaction was a transaction. Every emotion had a cost. They taught me to be calculating, to document everything, to never give anything for free. Now those skills would be their undoing. I gave them nothing, just as they'd trained me. The investigation accelerated. More people came forward with stories about my parents' behavior. Other families they'd threatened, co-workers who'd witnessed their cruelty, even church members who'd been uncomfortable with the public humiliations but hadn't known how to help. The isolated incident my parents claimed was revealing itself as a pattern. They tried one last manipulation. Mom came to my room crying, something I'd never seen before. She talked about her own childhood, the poverty, the struggle, how she'd only wanted better for me, how the system had gotten out of hand, how sorry she was. The tears seemed real, but I'd learned not to trust any emotion in this house. I listened without responding, and eventually she left. Dad tried next, offering a deal. He'd clear my credit, withdraw the charges if I'd just stop cooperating with the investigation. He presented it like a business negotiation, one collector to another, but I wasn't a collector. I was just a kid who'd been turned into a debt. The final blow came through the mail. Official notices from credit card companies freezing the accounts pending fraud investigation, legal documents from the district attorney's office, a letter from the school board reversing my withdrawal. The systems my parents had used to control others were closing in on them. They stopped sleeping, spending nights shredding documents and making panicked phone calls to lawyers. The house filled with tension so thick it was hard to breathe. They watched me constantly, as if I might disappear or spontaneously confess to crimes I hadn't committed, but I just maintained my blank expression, waiting. The parents discovering their perfect paper trail became perfect evidence against them. Is like watching someone build their own mousetrap and then step in it. Rodriguez basically gave them the federal crime forecast, and they still kept going. 3 weeks after that first meeting with CPS, the Guardian returned with news. The court had made decisions about my immediate future. My parents would maintain physical custody for now, but under strict conditions: weekly check-ins, family therapy, financial oversight. Any violation would result in immediate removal. More importantly, the criminal investigation was moving forward. The credit card fraud alone carried serious penalties. The systematic nature of the abuse, documented so thoroughly by my parents themselves, made it a complex case. The district attorney was particularly interested in the invoices sent to other families, seeing them as extortion attempts. My 18th birthday was still months away, but I finally had hope it would arrive with freedom instead of slavery. The debt my parents had created, both financial and emotional, would be their burden to carry. They built a prison of paperwork and cruelty, never realizing they were locking themselves inside with me. The Guardian's visit changed everything. My parents couldn't maintain their facade anymore. Dad started drinking heavily, something I'd never seen before. Mom spent hours on the phone with lawyers, her voice growing more shrill with each call. They'd stopped pretending I was their daughter and started treating me like evidence they needed to destroy. The court-mandated therapy sessions became battlegrounds. My parents arrived with prepared statements, trying to convince the therapist I was a pathological liar. I sat silent through most sessions, letting their increasingly unhinged behavior speak for itself. The therapist took notes while Dad ranted about ungrateful children, and Mom produced new documents she'd fabricated to support their version of events. One afternoon, I came home to find them in my room, tearing it apart again. They discovered I'd been keeping a journal at school, hidden in Mrs. Chen's desk. Dad held the pages while Mom screamed about betrayal. I watched from the doorway as they shredded months of documentation, not realizing I'd already scanned every page. The financial oversight officer arrived for his first inspection while they were still destroying evidence. He found them surrounded by torn paper, their hands stained with ink. They tried to explain, but he'd already seen enough. He photographed everything, including the fresh scratches on my arms from where Mom had grabbed me. That night, they locked me in the basement instead of my room. No mattress this time, just concrete floor and darkness. I could hear them arguing above me, their voices carrying through the floorboards. Mom wanted to run. Dad insisted they could still win if they just stuck to their story. Neither seemed to realize their story had already fallen apart. The school resource officer found me there the next morning. My parents had forgotten I was supposed to be at school, and when I didn't show up, he'd come looking. The basement door was locked from the outside. The officer called for backup while my parents scrambled to explain why their child was imprisoned in their basement. Child Protective Services removed me that day. I packed what little I owned while my parents watched, held back by officers. Mom tried to hand me a bill for the emotional damage I'd caused. Dad shouted about contracts and legal obligations. The social worker guided me to her car while they raged about their rights as parents. The emergency foster placement was with an older couple across town. They'd fostered teenagers before and knew not to push. They showed me to a small room with an actual bed, a door that locked from the inside, and windows without boards. I spent the first night just opening and closing the door, amazed by the simple freedom of movement. My parents tried everything to get me back. They filed complaints against CPS, claiming religious persecution. They sued the school for interfering with parental rights. They sent letters to the foster family threatening legal action. Each desperate move only strengthened the case against them. The criminal charges came down 2 weeks later: identity theft, fraud, child abuse, extortion. The district district attorney had connected their threats to other families with their debt collection history. What they'd seen as clever parenting looked like a criminal enterprise to prosecutors. They were arrested at their home, still surrounded by the evidence they'd been too proud to fully destroy. I testified before the grand jury, showing them years of documentation, the ledgers, the contracts, the joy price chart. I explained how they'd trained me to be emotionless, how they'd isolated me from anyone who might help. The grand jury members looked horrified as I described kneeling on rice while reciting my debt. My foster parents drove me to every court appointment, never asking questions about what happened inside. They'd make sandwiches for the drive home and let me eat in silence. They understood that some wounds needed time before they could be examined. The trial date approached while I tried to navigate senior year. The school had reinstated me with full privileges, and teachers bent over backwards to help me catch up. Mrs. Chen tutored me after school, refusing any payment. She said watching me walk at graduation would be payment enough. My parents' lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but they refused. They still believed they'd done nothing wrong, that charging children for happiness was innovative parenting. They demanded a jury trial, confident they could convince 12 strangers that I was the real criminal. I spent hours with the prosecutor, preparing for testimony. She showed me how to stay calm under cross-examination, how to let the evidence speak for itself. We practiced until I could recite the facts without emotion. The same dead expression my parents had trained into me now serving justice instead of survival. The trial lasted 2 weeks. My parents sat at the defense table, taking notes like they were still keeping ledgers. They dressed conservatively, trying to look like concerned parents instead of the calculating abusers they were. Their lawyer painted me as a troubled teen who'd fabricated abuse to escape reasonable discipline. When I took the stand, I brought the laminated price chart. The prosecutor held it up for the jury to see. $25 for visible joy, 10 for laughing, 5 for smiling. I explained how I'd learned to budget happiness like other kids budgeted allowance money. The jury members' faces told me everything I needed to know. The defense attorney tried to twist my words, suggesting I'd been a difficult child who needed structure. I responded with facts, dates, amounts. Every question designed to make me emotional met with the same blank expression my parents had demanded. They'd trained me too well to break under pressure. Other witnesses testified about the bills they'd received, the threats, the lawsuits. The bank manager explained how he discovered the fraud. Rodriguez described recognizing the debt collection tactics being used on a child. Each testimony added another brick to the wall building around my parents. The prosecutor presented financial records showing how my parents had used the credit cards they'd opened in my name, thousands in electronics they'd sold, cash advances that went straight to their accounts. They'd been stealing from my future while charging me for the crime of being happy. My parents testified in their own defense, still convinced they could explain their system reasonably. Dad brought charts showing the correlation between childhood happiness and adult failure. Mom cited articles about the dangers of participation trophies. They genuinely couldn't understand why the jury looked disgusted. During closing arguments, the prosecutor held up the joy ledger one final time. She asked the jury to imagine a childhood where every smile came with a price tag, where laughter led to debt, where a parent's love was a transaction. She asked them to consider what kind of people would monetize their own child's emotions. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. I sat in the gallery as the judge read each charge, watching my parents' faces cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally fear. They'd spent so many years as collectors, they'd never imagined becoming the collected. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge had reviewed everything, including a victim impact statement I'd written with my therapist's help. He sentenced them to 5 years each, plus restitution for the fraud. They'd have to pay back every penny they'd stolen, with interest. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After the sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with my foster parents. Reporters wanted statements, but I had nothing left to say. Everything important had been said in court, documented in evidence, proven beyond reasonable doubt. I walked away while my parents were led to transport vans. The guardian helped me file for emancipation, which was granted given the circumstances. At 17, I was legally free. The foster family offered to let me stay until graduation, and I accepted. They never asked me to smile or charged me for being happy. They just provided a safe place to figure out who I was without a price tag. College acceptances started arriving in spring. The state university honored their original offer, even increasing the scholarship amount. Mrs. Chen wrote recommendation letters explaining my circumstances. Other teachers contributed to a fund for my expenses. The community that my parents had tried to build was investing in my future instead. I started therapy properly, learning to unpack 13 years of transactional love. The therapist helped me understand that joy wasn't a luxury to be budgeted, but a basic human right. We worked on expressing emotions without calculating their cost. Some days were harder than others. My 18th birthday arrived with no fanfare, no contracts to sign, no debts to assume, no ledgers tracking my worth. My foster parents made a cake. I blew out the candles without worrying about the price of birthday joy. It was a small moment, but it was free, and it was mine. The credit repair process took months. Every fraudulent charge had to be disputed. Every account closed properly. The financial crimes unit helped navigate the paperwork. Slowly, my credit score climbed from the ruins my parents had created. By graduation, I'd been approved for student loans in my own name. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, seeing Mrs. Chen crying in the audience. My foster parents took pictures while my biological parents sat in prison cells. The applause was thunderous, and for the first time in my life, I smiled without checking the price first. That summer, I worked at a normal job for normal wages that went into my own bank account. No garnishments, no debt payments, no one calculating the cost of my existence. I saved every penny for college, but also bought myself small things just because I could. A book that made me laugh, ice cream on a hot day. Freedom came in tiny, affordable packages. The university dorms felt like another new beginning. My roommate had no idea about my past, and I didn't tell her. We stayed up late laughing about stupid things, and no one sent me a bill. I joined clubs without worrying about joy charges. I made friends who'd never received invoices for associating with me. Sometimes I'd catch myself calculating the cost of happiness out of habit. A laugh would die in my throat as I mentally added $10 to an imaginary debt. But those moments grew rarer, as genuine emotions replaced the transactional ones I'd been taught. Recovery wasn't linear, but it was real. The restitution checks came monthly, small amounts from my parents' prison wages. I donated them to a fund for abused children. Those dollars had been extracted from my joy. Now they'd help other kids find theirs. It felt like breaking the cycle they'd tried to create. I studied accounting in college, understanding numbers in ways my parents never had. Debits and credits, assets and liabilities, but also value that couldn't be quantified. Some things I learned were beyond price. Love wasn't a transaction. Happiness wasn't a debt. Joy wasn't something to be collected. Years later, I became a forensic accountant specializing in financial abuse cases. I learned to spot the patterns, the control disguised as concern, the love with strings attached. I helped other victims untangle the financial webs their abusers had woven. Each case I solved felt like payment on a different kind of debt. My parents were released after serving 3 years with good behavior. They sent a letter through their lawyer, demanding I pay them back for the cost cost of raising me. I didn't respond. Some debts I'd learned were never meant to be paid. Some collectors had no right to collect. Some ledgers deserve to be burned. Thanks for letting me wonder about all these twists and turns with you today. Funny how stories can leave you with more questions than answers, but maybe that's the point.